All right, everybody. It's noon. This is a breakout session, so it's just me saying to you, welcome. I am delighted to be here. My name is Andrew Petiprin. I am the Fellow of Popular Culture at the Word on Fire Institute, and I'm going to talk to you today about movies, and I'm going to jump right to my conclusion, which is you all should watch more good movies. So if you're on the fence about whether to stay here or go listen to my friend and colleague, Dr. Todd Warner, that's what I'm going to say. So if you'd like to find out how we get to the conclusion, you ought to watch more good movies, please stick around. It is really an honor to be back at the Good News Conference. I had the honor of speaking last year at the conference in Orlando, and it seems to me this is really going to be the conference, don't you think? I mean, I am so excited and impressed by everyone, so it is just an incredible privilege to be included among so many great speakers and people of faith. It's also great to be here in the Valley of the Sun. I haven't been here in quite some time, but I used to live in this area. My son was born here in Phoenix, so it is a real, a piece of my heart is kind of here. So I am really delighted to kind of see that incredibly blue sky and kind of the brown, hilly stuff all over the place again. I love it. I hope you guys enjoy it while you are here in the Valley. All right, I want to talk about movies, about the Catholic Church's relationship with the motion picture. And as I've already said, I want to recommend that you watch more movies, and I'm going to point you in the direction of some that might be a good place to be edified. But first, I just want to think with you all for a few minutes about how and what we watch just in general. In our increasingly fragmented and individualized cultures, note I say cultures there rather than culture, we all watch a lot. And we watch a lot in relation to the cultures that we identify with. Gone are the days of a single culture that shapes the moral imagination of a large group of people like a nation. It's not the middle of the 20th century anymore. Rather, we use the word culture not only to apply to certain maybe ethnic groups, for example, Hispanic Americans or Chinese American cultures, right? But also increasingly with regard to hobbies and identity markers. Have any of you heard terms like coffee roasting culture? Or cycling culture, or my favorite, cinema culture. That's a culture that I identify with. So there are all these different cultures, but everybody is watching. There's so much data to prove that. I've got a few data points to share with you today, but I'm not so good with numbers, so I'll be sparing. But we watch a lot. And in fact, a better word for most of the watching that we do might be consume. We consume images. Both still images and motion pictures in all kinds of different media. Images flood our minds at all times, but maybe even more significant than that, even more significant than all the images that we're consuming, whether we kind of want to or not, is the fact that we all, or most of us anyway, live with this kind of low-level anxiety. For some of us, it might actually be a high-level anxiety, not only about consuming, but creating images to share. Does anybody feel that way? Probably you've been doing that since you've been at the conference, taking pictures, putting them on social media. I often think about this tweet that I read several years ago by the great comedic actor Bill Murray, who provided a little bit of context for me about this phenomenon that we live in today that was totally unheard of, I don't know how long ago, 15 years ago, certainly 20 years ago. He said this, "I'm old enough to remember a time when I would go all day without taking a picture of anything." Isn't that crazy? For most of you, can you even remember the last time you spent an entire day without taking a picture of anything? I know we've got a couple of Dominican nuns over here. They probably are they're the exception to the rule. We've got a few exceptional people around here, thanks be to God. But most of us, we live in this cycle, don't we? There's another bit from another funny man, the comedian Jerry Seinfeld, who in one of his comedy routines, he talks about how when he was a little kid, he'd be out with his parents somewhere and they'd see something, and inevitably one would say to the other, "Oh, I wish I had a camera." Does that sound familiar to you too? I remember my parents saying things like that when we were out. "Oh, wish I had a camera." Now, of course, we all have cameras. We're all photographers, we're all movie makers, we're all producers, we're all script writers, we're all actors. This is how we live. Some of you may also remember an advertising campaign back in the year 1991 from Canon Cameras, which featured the professional tennis player Andre Agassi, offering us the tagline, "Image is everything." Well, at the time, it was just meant to sort of sell cameras, but nowadays, it sure seems prophetic, doesn't it? Maybe with one slight adjustment. Not image is everything, but images are everything. Now, around the same time that Andre Agassi was uttering his famous PR slogan, there was released a film by a German director named Wim Wenders. Both of those are with W's, by the way, Wimwenders, Wim Wenders. And the film is called Until the End of the World. It's a really long movie that exists in all kinds of different formats. If you have the Criterion channel or subscribe to Criterion, you can watch all different versions of this if you want. It's a pretty good movie, I think. Some of you may recognize the title, Until the End of the World, from a song by the band U2. Their song, Until the End of the World, was on their 1991 album, Achtung Baby, a great album, in my opinion. Now, this film, Until the End of the World, stars William Hurt, Sam Neill, Max von Sydow, Jean Moreau, and a whole lot of other great actors. And it is, as I mentioned, rather long and somewhat confusing, but ultimately very illustrative. It's about the apocalypse, the fear of the apocalypse happening in kind of the conventional way. In this film, it happens not to be nuclear war, but actually the fear that satellites that are somehow nuclear, I don't know the science of it, but these satellites are suddenly going to fall out of the sky down onto the earth and kind of destroy humanity. So there ensues in this film, if you haven't seen it, kind of a road trip, kind of a mystery. All this stuff ends up happening where people are trying to figure out where not to be when these satellites fall out of the sky and kill lots of people. So the main actors in the film end up down in Australia, which represents kind of the end of the world. And if you've ever seen films by George Miller, the Mad Max films, for example, you may have this, I don't know, I do. If anyone here is from Australia, I've never been there, I really would love to visit someday. But sometimes in certain cinematic contexts, it really can kind of symbolize the end of the world. I mean, it's so far away from everything, isn't it? And there's so much desert and uninhabited land there, isn't there? Well, that's where this film takes us. In the second half of the film, in Australia, we meet a scientist who is experimenting with capturing human dreams and then giving them back to their recipients to watch on handheld screens. The native Australians, the Aborigines who are helping this doctor with his project, once they find out what the result of the experiments is, they abandon it. They leave in a panic. They realize that what the doctor has done is tapped into something really unnatural and not good. Our dreams are meant to stay dreams. We're meant to wake up from them and move on, not focus on them and become obsessed with them. Images per se, in other words, are not necessarily good for us. Images have great power over us and over entire cultures. Anyway, this doctor in the film, Dr. Farber, played by Max von Sydow, he and two other characters in the film become addicted to watching their dreams on their individual handheld screens. Remember, this movie came out in 1991. There did exist certain personal devices at that time. I remember, I think at this time in my life, I had what was called a Game Boy, a little electronic video game system. But I certainly didn't have a cell phone. No one I knew had a cell phone. What a ridiculous idea. But these people in this film get addicted to watching their own dreams on their individual handheld screens. One character in the film, Eugene, who's played by Sam Neill, he's a novelist, and he does not buy this. He won't go along with it. He won't subject himself to the experiments where his dreams get captured, and he won't become addicted to looking at a screen. All he cares about are words. And it turns out he really cares about the word. More about that in just a moment. But he's so concerned about one of the other characters, a character named Claire, that he actually sort of abducts her and takes her into the desert where her screen batteries die, and she ends up sort of freaking out, like she's going through symptoms of withdrawal, like a drug addict. Have any of you lost your phone? How did it feel? It feels kind of sickening, doesn't it? It's weird. I hate it, but I feel it too. Anyway, Eugene, as Claire is suffering, we hear his interior monologue. As I said, he's a writer, and he offers a reflection on the state of reality. Here's what he says. Soon they were hooked, all of them. They lived to see their dreams, and when they slept, they dreamed about their dreams. They had arrived at the island of dreams together, but in a short time, they were oceans apart. They had made monsters for themselves that they could neither tolerate nor do without. They wandered in and out of lost worlds. Feelings and figures emerged as from a forgotten past. The dreams became black holes of isolation. They suffered, finally, from a complete loss of reality. This is the danger of certain kinds of images that we subject ourselves to, losing touch with reality. Eugene, this character, he then goes in a more theological direction, which I want to use as a jumping off point for the rest of what I have to say to you today. He says, I'd always cherished the beginning of the gospel according to St. John. In the beginning was the Word. I was not afraid, however, that the apocalypse would read, in the end, there were only images. Wow. In the beginning was the Word, but the danger that he's suddenly confronting is that it's the end, and there's no word. It's only images. That's the rub. Only images. What we are looking for as fans of movies is logos-rich images, word and image together. And I think the best films do exactly that. Not taking us out of reality, but bring us deeper into reality. Not turning us downwards towards our own sort of individual dreamlike stuff, but rather out of ourselves, yes, to a place of contemplation and a particularly kind of individualized and subjective experience, but also something that connects us deeply to God and to each other. Now, we watch all kinds of things. There's all kinds of statistics that you could look at if you wanted to. There's 300 hours of video content uploaded to YouTube every single minute. More video content gets uploaded to the internet in 30 days than what the major U.S. television networks have broadcast in the last 30 years. And more than 75% of everything we watch on our mobile devices. But the good news is we are still watching movies. Not just cat videos and, epic fail videos. I'm letting you know my temptations here. I'm sorry, but some of you may have the same. But there are still so many great movies, and people are watching movies. But let me back up a little bit and talk about the history of movie watching in relation to the church. Bear with me here just for a moment. In the year 1930, 65% of the population of the United States went to the movies weekly. Let that sink in. In 1930, 65% of Americans went to the movies every single week. Let me ask you all a question, if you feel comfortable. How many of you have been to the movies in the year of our Lord 2022? Okay, good. I am really happy to see that. Most of you have, because you came to this talk, so you like movies. Okay, excellent. And you're fans of Bishop Robert Barron and kind of the whole new media thing, so good. But going to the movies isn't such a popular activity as it once was. It used to be the premier leisure activity. There was no comparison to it. It was the best place to escape the cold, the heat, and loneliness. I just mentioned 1930. That was the beginning of a really hard time in the United States. It was a good place for people to be brought together, and not just in the United States, in other places too. If you've ever seen the great Italian movie, Cinema Paradiso, there's this sense of that in Italy as well. Like during these tough times, like in this small town in Sicily, everybody goes to the movies. No matter what is coming through, everybody goes to see it. And it kind of brings the community together. So, because movies had become such a big deal by the year 1930, it was time that the church weigh in on what movies were, what they could be, what they should be. And in 1929, we get the first word about this from Pope Pius XI, who wrote a document on Christian education called Divini Illius Magistri. He talked about cinema in this document, and he said that the movies multiply every kind of exhibition. And he compared movies to, quote, how St. Augustine deplored the passion for the shows of the circus, which possessed even some Christians of his time. So note the tone there. The church was really worried about movies in 1929. In 1936, the same Pope, Pius XI, built on these ideas in the first encyclical on the motion picture called Vigilanti Cura. He talked about how movies were capable of exercising a profoundly moral influence upon those who see them. I don't think any of us would object to that sentiment, would we? But he also lamented the film industry's failure to police its moral content, and he commended the now infamous Legion of Decency. Has anybody ever heard of that? More about it in a moment. He noted the urgent need for a national reviewing system in countries that made films. And at this time, the two biggest film producers in the world were the United States and Italy. But in the decades that followed, things changed. By the 1950s and 1960s, film had become not just the most popular diversion, but this is controversial, but I will stand by this to my grave, the highest form of art by the 1950s and 60s. This is when the great auteurs of Italian neorealism, the French New Wave, Ingmar Bergman in Sweden, Andrei Tarkovsky in Russia, Hitchcock, this is when the great masters that we still admire were doing their best stuff. Suddenly, watching movies could be very entertaining and fun, yes, but it could also be just as likely to be something more like walking through the Louvre or reading a classic novel. And so the church's official engagement with movies had to change. It wasn't so much just the case that the church had to play the part of the moral referee. It was time really to weigh in on the aesthetics, on the effect that films could have on the imagination from this highly artistic point of view. And so in 1955, Pope Pius XII issued an apostolic exhortation to representatives of the cinema industry, and he talked about the criteria for an ideal film. Isn't that interesting? In 1955, the Pope says, here's what I think makes a great movie. It's pretty cool. You can read it online. It's very readable. The Pope began by saying that a film should, first of all, always contain, quote, respect for man, and it should add, quote, loving understanding in depicting man's condition. He talked about how film served a role in people's lives, once filled by other things, that provided hope, that provided an avenue for relief, where they could see themselves as lovable creatures and find understanding of the reality that they inhabited. The Pope concluded his remarks by talking about the lofty and positive mission of everyone who stands behind the camera. And he also talked about film critics. He wanted to make it clear that the people who promote movies, talk about movies, think about movies, the kind of stuff that I get to do for a living, which is pretty amazing, that we think of our role as a bona fide vocation within the church. Now, an example of how this happens is I like to use this film by Federico Fellini called 8½. I've written about it before. I made a video about it. You might have seen it, but I want to talk about it again just for a second. And for some of you, it'll be brand new. You may not have heard of it. It's a really interesting movie. It's one of the most famous films ever made about film, about art in general in the 20th century. It had a huge impact on lots of filmmakers that came after Fellini. And the film is about a Roman film director, played by Marcello Mastroianni, whose life is kind of spinning out of control. He's trying to figure out what the next movie is that he ought to make, and he settles on trying to make a movie about his childhood that is supposed to be highly critical of the Catholic Church of his youth. It's got all kinds of wild stuff, dream sequences. It's certainly not an easy film to watch. But there's an interesting part in it where he's talking to a film critic who engages him, the main character in the film, whose name is Guido, engages him about the nature of art and of faith. And Guido tells his idea to the film critic. I'm going to make this movie where I criticize the church by talking about kind of the harshness of my childhood and all this sort of thing. And the film critic says to him that it's based in nostalgia and that his idea has, quote, all the intentions of an accomplice. In other words, he's going to try to make a negative film about the church, and he's going to end up making a positive film about the church. And in a sense, that's what 8½ is, if you watch this movie. It is definitely not a pro-church film on the surface, but it's kind of hard to walk away from watching this movie and not sort of feel good about being a Catholic. That's my feeling, honestly. Now, earlier on, I mentioned this organization called the Legion of Decency. Some of you recognize that name. You've heard of it before. If you haven't, let me just tell you something about it and connect it back up with 8½. The history of this group and of what they did is really fascinating. I don't really have time to go into all of it here, but what it was a system within the United States in the Catholic Church that existed from 1933 to 1980, where there were official letter grades given to films that were issued. And the most serious letter grade that could be given was the C rating, the condemned rating. And between this time span of 1933 and 1980, there were exactly 148 movies worldwide that were given the C rating by the Legion of Decency. And that meant that they were deemed officially by the Catholic Church in the United States unacceptable for viewing by Catholics. Now, here's the interesting thing about this. The movies on this list are not like pornographic videos. They're mainstream movies, and they contain some really interesting selections that I'll give you just a little smattering of them here. There are 2 Alfred Hitchcock movies on the list. Alfred Hitchcock, who was a Catholic. Those movies are Psycho and Torn Curtain. Psycho is pretty tough. Torn Curtain has this one really brutal scene in it, and I think that's why it got the condemned rating. Sergio Leone's spaghetti westerns, they're on there. Movies like The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby, which are actually pretty popular to watch for Catholics to kind of consider, both kind of positive and negative representations of kind of the unseen reality of the demonic, right? But then there's some real head scratchers on there. Here's one, Miracle on 34th Street. I know, it's crazy, right? I think it's because the woman's divorced. I don't know, it's something anyway, but that's on there. Like, you wouldn't watch that today and think, oh my goodness, that's going to scandalize the world, right? But guess what other movie is on this list? 8½, the one that I was just telling you about, Federico Fellini's great masterpiece. But here's the other thing about 8½. It is the one and only film out of 148 on that condemned list that also made its way onto a completely different list. In fact, it's kind of the opposite list. And it is called the Vatican Film List from 1995. Have any of you ever heard of the Vatican Film List from 1995? Very few of you have. That's very interesting. Well, I am writing a book about it. So, along with 2 other people, so next year you should have the opportunity to buy this wonderful book that will tell you about the 45 films, which in 1995, the Vatican said, these are interesting movies that you might want to take a look at. They include things you've heard of, like The Wizard of Oz, It's a Wonderful Life, 2001: A Space Odyssey, stuff like that, but it's also got a lot of obscure stuff that you haven't heard of before, probably. But it's kind of wild that very few of you have heard of it. I would think that it's wild, except that I was recently writing to the famous John Paul II scholar George Weigel. Have any of you heard of him? He wrote the great big fat blue biography of John Paul II. And I wanted to write to him to ask him if he happened to remember any of the people who were involved in compiling this list back in the 90s, since he literally wrote the book about the era. And he said he had never heard of the list. Isn't that crazy? Thanks be to God, he has now, so maybe he's gonna check it out. But anyway, let me tell you about the list real quick. In March of 1995, John Paul II spoke to the Pontifical Commission for Social Communications to mark the 100th anniversary of the first public viewing of a motion picture. And he talked about the many worthwhile productions during the first 100 years of cinema's existence. He's picking up where Pius XII left off, talking about how there's all kinds of very good things that Catholics can get from watching movies, right? Later that same year, this same commission, the Pontifical Commission for Social Communications, came out with this list. Now, the list appeared just like this. It had a title on it which said, "Some Important Films." Then it had a list of 45 films, and that's it. This is one of the reasons why these two colleagues of mine and I are writing this little book for you all, because it hasn't really been sort of laid out to the world, like how edifying all 45 films on this list may be to us. Now, on this list, sorry, there is one other thing on the list I neglected. The films, the 45 films, are separated into three categories. One category called art, one category called religion, and one category called values. So these three categories, art, religion, values. And that, to my mind, acknowledges that the very classification of films, according to the church herself, is meant to serve a variety of different purposes, right? A film is not just to be judged on acceptable or condemned, right? Films serve lots of different purposes, just like any art form. And I think that this is an essential distinction that we need to think about, not only in our own viewing habits, but as we think of the work of evangelization through film and media. It's never a question of yes, no, acceptable, unacceptable. I mean, I've watched some really disturbing things that in a way I kind of wish I hadn't watched, but they've also kind of done something positive in the long run in my brain. I mean, that's the way stuff works. That's really powerful. That's an image that has logos in it. It's mysterious in a good way. What I think this means is we've got to get out into the deep. And the selections on the Vatican film list take us into the deep. Sometimes into a beautiful tale of Eucharistic abundance called Babette's Feast. Anybody seen that one? It's a wonderful movie. Or out into outer space, into an esoteric sci-fi exploration of human evolution in 2001: A Space Odyssey. Or maybe an examination of violence and warfare in a movie like Grand Illusion. There's all kinds of different stuff on that list. Now, earlier on, I was attempting to paint kind of a bleak picture of an image-rich but logos-poor reality that we live in today from all these videos that keep popping up on our phones, right? Image, 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 but where's the logos? Where's the word? We spend our lives swimming in an ocean of options delivered to us through a delivery means that the earliest filmmakers could never have imagined. What I'm getting at here is we have these devices that can give us all the garbage we could ever want, but also, unlike back in 1995 when the Vatican film list came out, and it was really difficult to even find some of the films on the list, you can watch any of them and all of them at the click of a mouse. It's easier than ever, actually, to find and consume the best stuff. And that's something we need to talk about. I mean, back in 1995, if you wanted to watch a film like Luis Buñuel's Nazarene, that's probably a movie no one in this room has ever heard about. I have to admit, I had never heard about it until last week when I wrote a chapter for my book about it. It's a great movie, by the way. But back in the 90s, if you wanted to watch a movie like that, I mean, good luck. Maybe there was like the one like weirdo art house video store that was about to get put out of business by Blockbuster. that maybe that guy could find it for you somewhere. Or maybe like there would be a little film festival on the local college campus, and if you happen to be free that night, you could go over and watch it, right? But all that's in the past now. We have access to all this stuff that we didn't used to have access to before. And the thing is, people still like to watch movies. They do. But very few people are going to the movie theater anymore to watch them. They're using their devices, they're watching at home. So that's something we need to keep in mind. We also need to keep in mind that among the movies that people do go to the movie theater and watch, they tend to be movies that are very, very different from these logos-rich sets of images that I want to propose are the way forward for us. Let me give you an example. The top 10 grossing movies of the last 35 years. Let me rattle them off for you. Avatar, Avengers Endgame, Titanic, Star Wars The Force Awakens, Avengers The Infinity War, Spider-Man No Way Home, Jurassic World, The Lion King live-action remake, The Avengers, and Furious 7. Those are the top 10 grossing movies of the last 35 years. And if you go right down the list to the top 20, top 30, top 40, top 50, they're all just like that. Now, some of those movies are great. That's fine. And they're good diversions, right? But they tend to be reboots, remakes, sequels, endless franchises from a small number of big studios, lots of CGI, lots of green screen, frankly, very forgettable stuff. I cannot remember at all what happens in one Marvel movie versus another. I don't know about you. It's just kind of a lot of things crashing into each other for 3 hours to me. Now, I've written about movies like that, and they're fine. My son loves that stuff. I don't know if he's ever going to listen to this talk, if it's being recorded, but he always gets mad at me whenever I criticize Marvel movies. I get it. But I also am concerned that what those kinds of movies that people go to the movie theater still to watch represent what the New York Times columnist Ross Douthat calls decadence. That it's really just kind of like the fruit of a culture that's kind of running out of gas and forgetting good ideas. That's kind of like losing track of the logos. So we as evangelists maybe want to go through that list from the Vatican. And then, the wonderful thing these days, if you watch one of those movies on a streaming service, it'll probably say, hey, have you ever thought about watching this one or this one or this one? And it might be a movie of kind of a similar caliber or quality. And just as both my colleague Jared Zimmer talked about yesterday and Bishop Barron talked about last night, things that are worthwhile are necessarily difficult, right? Like to get into Bach or to get into opera or just as Dr. Lev was talking about, the Sistine Chapel stuff. It's worth it though. And it's the same with cinema. It really is worth it to put in the time. And as I said, now that streaming is such a big thing, it's easier than ever to do that. For example, in June of 2022, Netflix had 3,781 movies you could watch anytime you wanted. Amazon Prime had 12,828 free movies. A lot of those movies are terrible, but plenty of them are great. They're right there. Now, my evangelism strategy that I want to wrap up with here is very simple for you today. I'm really kind of not at all a fan of silver bullets about evangelism. So my advice to you is watch these Vatican Film List movies. Watch some great movies. Let them infect you, infect your soul with this combination of image and logos, and then you might have something to say. Who knows? That's the mystery of it. That's the wonderful thing. As I said, I'm working on this book about this Vatican Film List, but I want to go beyond that because, of course, 1995 was a long time ago. There have been all kinds of wonderful, important things that have happened since then. And maybe you all and others will be involved in that work of getting to know and publicizing great films that have come out since the list in 1995. The Legion of Decency, as such, doesn't exist anymore, and for my part, I don't think we need it. Not to say we don't need guideposts to understand what may be inappropriate, but what I do think we need is something that might, in a way, sound like the opposite of the Legion of Decency. Maybe something like the Legion of Genius, or the Legion of Inspiration, or fitting for our topic in this conference, how about something like the Legion of Beauty? What if we Catholics were involved in rating, recommending, commending films, in a sense, for the opposite way, saying, here are the things that are worthwhile. One movie, just got a few minutes left, that's on the Vatican film list that I think might be a good starting point for some of us is a movie called Ordet, O-R-D-E-T, by a director named Carl Theodor Dreyer. The reason that I commend it to you is that the title, Ordet, in Danish, it's a Danish movie, means the Word. It's a movie called The Word. How appropriate is that? It's a film that forces us to watch it. It is not an easy movie. The scenes are long and the scenery is deliberately sparse. It's in Danish, so, that might be a challenge. It includes discussions of theology, but more importantly, it shows us a family and a community in which God is operating amid the day-to-day grind. It shows us incredibly miraculous things on screen, but situated in this very ordinary environment. It's the kind of thing that, non-believers, when we think about or talk about miracles, they might sort of say, yeah, I don't know, that sounds kind of cheesy to me. But if you watch a movie like Ordet, it's one of those movies that presents elements of our faith kind of like they're too good to be true, but also that they're too compelling to ignore. That's what the best films that deal with faith are able to do for us. Ordet is one of those. Not one film critic I've ever heard of, Catholic, non-believer, atheist, not one film critic I've ever heard of dislikes that movie. Everybody loves it. And it is literally a film about the Word, our Lord. Go and watch it. Let me end with this. The great French Catholic filmmaker Éric Rohmer described his vocation in this way. He said, I believe that true cinema is necessarily a Christian cinema because there is no truth except in Christianity. True cinema is necessarily Christian cinema. He continues, I believe in the genius of Christianity, and there is not a single great film in the history of cinema that is not infused with the light of the Christian idea. Think about that. Not a single great film in the history of cinema is not infused with the light of the Christian idea. Another Catholic filmmaker, a much more controversial one named Lars von Trier, who's still living and working today, he said this. He said, we need divine light, a change through the light. For me, that light is cinema, or it could be. I watch a lot of films, and often I almost want to cry because what I see is that divine light. Some of my favorite films give me this light. What can I add to that except to say that my favorite films give me that light too? I hope your favorite films do that for you. Really, speaking personally, I've yet to find any place in my own life where I find as much grace and truth from our Lord than in the great films that inspired people have been able to create. And so, I encourage all of you to watch more movies for the sake of the gospel. Thank you very much.